The circus had always been a place of wonder, where magic, joy, and childhood dreams converged beneath a grand, striped tent. For as long as Ethan could remember, he had loved the idea of the circus, the daring feats of the acrobats, the roaring applause from the crowd, and the flicker of lights that danced in every corner. Yet, at 28, Ethan had never actually been to one. Life had a way of keeping things at bay, and somehow, he had never made time for the circus, until now. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and Ethan's girlfriend, Lily, had surprised him with tickets to a local circus that was making its way through their town. She had been gushing about the show for weeks, excited for the daring stunts and the chance to experience something new together. Ethan had smiled at her enthusiasm, always enjoying how she embraced the small moments in life. He had no reason to think that anything would go wrong that night. In fact, the excitement of a circus show stirred something in him too, a nostalgia for the childhood he had missed out on. They arrived at the circus grounds just as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the tents. The air smelled sweet, a mixture of popcorn, cotton candy, and hay. As they made their way into the massive tent, they could hear the distant sound of a band tuning up, the upbeat rhythm already promising a lively performance. The inside of the tent was mesmerizing. Strings of lights twinkled above them, casting a soft, golden glow over the crowd. People laughed, children tugged at their parents' hands, and performers dressed in colorful costumes wove through the aisles, juggling and tumbling to the delight of the audience. Ethan found a sense of warmth and ease settling over him as they took their seats near the center. He had no idea that this night would change his life. The show began with a grand flourish, acrobats flipping through the air, barely missing each other by inches as they swung from one trapeze to another. The audience gasped and applauded, and Ethan found himself clapping along, fully immersed in the thrill of the moment. Everything was perfect. The vibrant costumes, the thunderous applause, the awe on Lily's face, it was all exactly how he had imagined the circus would be. But then, the atmosphere shifted. The lights dimmed, and a low, eerie melody began to play from the band. Ethan noticed something strange, a change in the energy around them, as if the air had thickened. The once cheerful music turned into a haunting tune, and from the shadows, a group of figures emerged. Clowns. They moved into the spotlight, one by one, their oversized shoes shuffling across the dirt floor, their faces painted in exaggerated grins that seemed to mock the audience. One of them, a tall, lanky clown with a face painted in stark white and deep red streaks, caught Ethan's eye. The clown's gaze was sharp, penetrating, almost as if he were looking directly into Ethan's soul. That grin, the twisted smile smeared across his face, seemed to grow wider the longer Ethan stared. It wasn't right. Something was off. Ethan's breath quickened, and his hands began to tremble slightly. He tried to look away, but his eyes kept being drawn back to the clown, who now seemed to be moving toward him. In that moment, something inside Ethan snapped. The clown, once just a performer in a colorful costume, now appeared grotesque, distorted, his limbs too long, his face too pale, the red streaks on his cheeks running like fresh blood. The other clowns, who had once been mere entertainers, now resembled nightmarish creatures, their painted faces twisting into monstrous forms. Their laughter, so light and playful moments ago, now echoed like a sinister cackle, growing louder and more menacing with each second. Ethan's heart raced, pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. His vision blurred, and the air around him seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead as panic gripped his chest like a vice. He had no idea what was happening to him, but every fiber of his being screamed that he needed to get OU of there now. The clown closest to him, his twisted face now looming impossibly large, seemed to stretch toward him, his painted grin growing wider and wider. Ethan felt like he was drowning, like the walls of the tent were closing in, trapping him in this nightmare. He gasped for air, his mind spiraling out of control, but no breath would come. All he could see were the clowns, their grotesque, misshapen bodies towering over him, their monstrous faces closing in. The world around him spun violently, and Ethan knew he was on the edge of something terrible. Ethan? Ethan, are you okay? Lily's voice was faint, distant, but it cut through the suffocating fog of his panic. He blinked, struggling to focus on her face, but everything was spinning. He tried to answer, but his voice wouldn't come. He could only shake his head as he gasped for air, his chest tightening painfully. It was as if the entire world had collapsed around him, and all that remained were the clowns, their grotesque laughter filling his ears, their monstrous grins bearing down on him. Lily's face shifted from concern to panic as she realized something was very wrong. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward her, but Ethan could barely register what was happening. The walls of the tent felt like they were closing in, the air too thick to breathe, the lights too bright, and the clowns, they were everywhere. His vision darkened around the edges as the sounds of the circus became distant and muffled, like he was sinking into a deep, dark ocean. Lily's voice was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality, though he could barely make out her words. She was calling his name, pulling him toward the exit, trying to break him out of the fog of panic that had engulfed him. As they stumbled through the crowd, Ethan's legs felt like jelly, and his breaths came in short, shallow gasps. He could barely see, barely think. All he knew was that he had to get away from the clowns. Finally, they burst out of the tent into the cool night air. The sudden change in temperature hit Ethan like a wave, shocking him back to the present. He gulped in air, his lungs burning as he struggled to regain control of his breathing. The clowns were gone. The night was quiet, and the stars twinkled overhead, completely indifferent to the terror that had just consumed him. Lily was still holding his arm, her eyes wide with worry. "Ethan, what happened? Are you okay? You looked like you couldn't breathe." Ethan leaned against a nearby fence, his head spinning as he tried to piece together what had just happened. He had never experienced anything like this before. It was as if his mind had been taken over by some primal fear, something deep and dark that he didn't even know existed within him. He looked at Lily, his heart still racing, and shook his head. I don't know," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "I couldn't breathe. The clowns, they scared you?" Lily asked gently, her hands still on his arm. "I've never seen you like that. I thought you were going to pass out." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had never been afraid of clowns before, or at least, he had never thought he was. But the way they had appeared to him, so monstrous, so distorted, had triggered something deep inside him that he couldn't explain. It wasn't rational, it wasn't something he could put into words, but in that moment, surrounded by those painted faces and twisted grins, he had felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. "I don't know what that was," Ethan admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "I've never felt like that before. It was like they weren't just clowns. They were monsters." Lily frowned, her concern deepening. "Maybe you have some kind of phobia?" "I mean, it's not uncommon. A lot of people are scared of clowns." Ethan nodded slowly, though he still couldn't fully wrap his mind around what had just happened. It felt ridiculous to think that he might have a fear of clowns, something that had never bothered him before. But what else could explain the sudden wave of panic that had consumed him? The way his mind had twisted their faces, the way their laughter had become sinister and threatening, like something out of a nightmare? Lily stayed by his side as Ethan slowly regained his composure. The circus sounds were still audible in the distance, the cheers of the crowd, the upbeat music, the hum of excitement, but it all felt far away, like another world entirely. The bright lights of the circus tent seemed to mock him now, a place that had once promised joy and wonder, but had instead become the setting of his darkest fear. For the rest of the night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The fear that had surfaced in that tent, the panic that had overwhelmed him, wasn't something he could just brush off. It was as if a door had been opened inside his mind, a door that revealed a part of him he hadn't known existed. The clowns, once innocent performers, had become the embodiment of his deepest fears. And now, even standing outside in the cool night air, far from the circus and its painted performers, Ethan knew that things would never quite be the same again. That hidden fear, once unknown, had been unleashed, and there was no telling what other doors it might open in the future.